The spotlight intensifies as the opening music echoes through the studio. The iconic theme from The Doctor. Phil's show resonates from the speakers, announcing another episode full of drama and shocking revelations. The familiar set, with its strategically positioned armchairs in the center of the stage, awaits the entrance of today's guests. An ordinary American family, or at least that's what everyone believes up to this point. The audience settles into their seats, murmurs of anticipation filling the air. On screens around the studio, images of a seemingly happy family alternate with more recent photos showing expressions of distrust and despair. The narrator's deep, penetrating voice begins to tell a story no one could have imagined. The Wilson family has always been admired in their small Nebraska community. Richard and Margaret, married for nearly 3 decades, raised 2 children, and built a life many envied. Behind Richard's warm smile, however, lay a secret so profound it would shake the foundations not only of his marriage, but of his entire existence. A man who, for 25 years, lived as someone he wasn't. A fabricated identity, an entire life built on lies. And today, on Dr. Phil's stage, the truth will finally come to light. The cameras show Margaret Wilson, a 58-year-old woman with gray hair and eyes red from crying. Beside her, her adult children, Jennifer, 27, and Michael, 24, maintain somber expressions. The chair intended for Richard remains empty, creating a palpable tension in the studio. The man Margaret met in 1998 won her heart with stories of a difficult childhood in the Midwest and an honorable military career. A decorated veteran who survived dangerous missions and returned to build a peaceful life. A man who seemed to have solid values, unwavering character, and a generous heart. But after an unexpected phone call just 3 weeks ago, everything Margaret thought she knew about the man with whom she had shared her bed for over 2 decades crumbled like a house of cards. Before we continue with this impactful story, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of Dr. Phil's upcoming revelations. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what you think will happen in this case. Your opinion is very important for us to continue bringing you this exclusive content that transforms lives. The imposing figure of Dr. Phil appears on stage, walking with determination. His piercing eyes show a mixture of compassion and firmness as he approaches Margaret and her children. The audience applauds, but the atmosphere in the studio is heavy, laden with suppressed emotion. Margaret, Jennifer, Michael, thank you for coming today, says Dr. Phil, his unmistakable Texan voice echoing through the studio. I know this isn't an easy time for you, but I believe it's important that we bring this situation to light. Margaret nods, clutching a handkerchief between her fingers. Her posture is rigid, as if she's gathering all her strength to avoid collapsing right there, in front of the cameras and millions of viewers. 25 years, she murmurs, her voice trembling. 25 years believing I knew the man I married. Dr. Phil leans forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Margaret's. Tell us how it all began. How did you meet Richard? Margaret takes a deep breath, trying to organize thoughts that now seem fragmented. We met in 1998 at a veterans fundraiser. He was charming, attentive. He said he'd served in the Army for 12 years, including missions in the Persian Gulf. Her eyes fill with tears. He had all the stories, all the answers. Framed medals in our office. Photographs, which I now know were manipulated. The cameras captured Jennifer's face, her gaze lowered, clearly devastated. Michael, on the other hand, displays an expression of restrained anger, his jaw clenched in tension. And when did things start to change? Asks Dr. Phil, keeping his voice calm but incisive. 3 weeks ago, Michael interjects, no longer able to contain himself. We received a phone call from a woman named Susan Blackwood. She said she had seen my father's picture in a local newspaper, where he was being honored as a veteran at a community event. His voice falters momentarily. She said my father wasn't Richard Wilson, that his real name is Thomas Reynolds, that he abandoned his first wife and 3 children in Connecticut in 1997, and that he never served a single day in the military. The audience reacts with a collective murmur of astonishment. Dr. Phil maintains his composed expression, but his eyes reveal that even he, with decades of experience in family dramas, is stunned by the magnitude of the betrayal. And did you confront Richard or Thomas with this information? Asks Dr. Phil. Margaret wipes away a tear. I confronted him that same night. First he denied everything, said it was some kind of mistake. Then he got furious, accused me of not trusting him after so many years together. She pauses painfully. But when I mentioned the name Thomas Reynolds, I saw it in his eyes. It was true. Everything was true. Dr. Phil nods, processing the information, and he's here today. Did he agree to participate in the program? Yes, Margaret replied, her voice suddenly firmer. He's backstage. He said he wants to try to explain, that he has his reasons. But how can anyone explain 25 years of lies? How can you explain that our entire marriage was based on a sham? Jennifer, who had been silent until then, finally speaks, her voice almost a whisper. The worst part is, I don't know who my father is anymore. Every memory, every piece of advice, every moment we shared, it all seems tainted now. How can I trust someone who has lived a lie for so long? Doctor. Phil turns to the audience and then to the camera. Today we're going to meet a man who lived under a false identity for over 2 decades. We're going to hear his explanations and, more importantly, try to understand how a family can begin to process this kind of betrayal. He pauses dramatically. Richard Wilson, or should I say, Thomas Reynolds, is here today to confront his family and the truth he's tried to hide for so long. The studio lights adjust, creating a dramatic focus on the side entrance. A middle-aged man with gray hair and a defensive posture walks slowly to the center of the stage. His hands tremble slightly, and his face displays a mixture of shame and determination. He avoids the family's gaze and sits in the chair indicated by Dr. Phil, a few meters away from Margaret and her children. Richard, or would you prefer I call you Thomas? Asks Dr. Phil, his tone making it clear that this is no casual conversation. The man swallows hard, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. I've been Richard for so long that I've almost forgotten who Thomas is, he admits, his voice low and tense. Well, I think it's time we all knew the truth about Thomas Reynolds. Don't you agree, Doctor? Phil isn't waiting for an answer. You're here today by your own choice. No one forced you to come. That means that, on some level, you recognize that your family deserves explanations. Richard, Thomas nods slowly. I made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but everything I did, after the first became Richard, was trying to be a good husband and father. He risks a glance at Margaret. The love I feel for you and the children is real. It was never a lie. Michael lets out a bitter laugh. Children? We have other siblings in Connecticut who don't even know we exist. What kind of father abandons 3 children to raise others as if the first ones never existed? The studio falls silent as Dr. Phil focuses entirely on Richard, Thomas. The lights seem to intensify on the man, as if the setting itself were determined to expose each of his secrets. Let's start from the beginning, says Dr. Phil, his tone firm and unwavering. Who is Thomas Reynolds? And why did he decide to disappear in 1997 to become Richard Wilson? Richard, Thomas sighs deeply, running his hands over his face in a gesture that suggests both weariness and resignation. I was born in Hartford, Connecticut. I married young, at 22, to my high school sweetheart, Laura. We had 3 children in quick succession. He pauses, as if each word is being extracted from him with great resistance. I worked as an accountant at a small firm, but I always struggled with problems. What kind of problems? Dr. Phil presses. Gambling, Richard, Thomas admits, lowering his head. I started betting small amounts, but the situation quickly got out of control. In 1997, I owed over $100,000 to dangerous people. People who threatened not only me, but my family. Margaret's voice is a mixture of disbelief and pain, and her solution was to abandon her first family and create a completely new one. How does that make sense, Doctor? Phil raises his hand, signaling to Margaret that he will conduct the interrogation. Go on, Thomas. What happened then? I panicked, Richard, Thomas confesses. The creditors were getting impatient. I received explicit threats against Laura, and the children died so. I made the hardest decision of my life. His voice falters momentarily. I decided that everyone would be safer if I simply disappeared. So you were protecting your first family by abandoning them? Asked Dr. Phil, his skepticism evident. I left almost all the money we had to Laura and the children, along with a letter explaining that I needed to leave, but without going into details about the debts. I thought that if they didn't know, they would be safer. Richard, Thomas seems to realize as he speaks how empty his justifications sound. I know it sounds terrible now. It sounds terrible because it is terrible, emphasizes drive, Phil. But that doesn't explain how you became Richard Wilson, a decorated veteran with a completely fabricated story. Richard, Thomas lowers his head. I fled west. I worked temporary jobs, paying in cash, leaving no trace. Eventually, I managed to get false documents, fake documents, interrupts Dr. Phil. So, in addition to family abandonment, we're talking about identity fraud, a federal crime. Yes, Richard, Thomas admits quietly, I created a new identity. Richard Wilson, born in Iowa, Army veteran. I figured if I had a military service history, people would ask fewer questions about my past. Jennifer, who had been watching with wide eyes, finally speaks, and all those stories about your time in the Army, the overseas missions, the medals, all made up, everything. Richard, Thomas confirms, unable to look at his daughter. I read books, watched documentaries, absorbed stories from real veterans I knew. The medals, I bought them in military supply stores and antique shops. Dr. Phil's expression hardens. So not only did he lie to his family, but he also presented himself as a veteran when he never served a single day. You know there's a term for that, right? It's called stolen valor. It's considered one of the most despicable behaviors in our society, faking military service that never happened. Richard, Thomas seems to physically diminish under the weight of the accusations. I know, and I deeply regret it. But over time, the lie became so elaborate, so ingrained in who I was, that I could no longer imagine a way out. And your first family, Dr. Phil asks, Laura and the children you abandoned, what happened to them? I don't know, Richard, Thomas admits. Initially, I planned to get in touch when the death situation was resolved, but then I met Margaret, started a new life. His voice falters. Each passing year made it harder to look back. The camera captures Michael leaning forward, his eyes filled with contained fury. So you simply decided that your first family no longer mattered? That you could start from scratch, as if they never existed? That's not how it was, Richard, Thomas protests, but his words sound weak even to his own ears. Dr. Phil picks up an envelope from the table beside him. Thomas, we have some information about your first family that I think you should know. He opens the envelope with deliberate slowness. Following the phone call Margaret received, our team contacted Laura Reynolds in Connecticut. Richard, Thomas's face visibly pales. Did you speak to Laura? Yes, Doctor. Phil confirms, and I'll share something she told us. After you disappeared, leaving only a vague letter and a few $1,000s, Laura struggled to raise 3 children alone. Her oldest son, David, was only 10 when you left. Her daughter, Amy, was 8, and her youngest, Robert, was 5. The studio falls completely silent as Dr. Phil continues. Laura never remarried. She worked 2 jobs to support her family. David gave up a college scholarship to start working and help at home. Both boys grew up with serious abandonment and trust issues. Amy developed chronic depression in adolescence. Each word seems to hit Richard, Thomas like a physical blow. His hands tremble as he covers his face. The most ironic thing, Dr. Phil continues, is that these dangerous creditors you mentioned never threatened your family after your disappearance. In fact, Laura informed us that, about 6 months after you vanished, a man appeared at her door, saying that her debts had been canceled due to the circumstances. He even left an envelope with $10,000 as compensation. Richard, Thomas looks up, shocked. This isn't possible. It's the truth, Doctor. Phil states, you abandoned your family for nothing. And while you were building a new life as a fictional war hero, your real children were growing up fatherless, facing real hardships that you could have helped alleviate if you had been there. Phil rises from his chair, a technique he rarely uses, only in moments of great significance. He walks slowly toward Richard, Thomas, who now appears physically smaller, hunched over under the weight of the revelations. Thomas, is there something else you haven't told Margaret and her children? Some other lie or secret that hasn't yet been revealed? Doctor. Phil's voice carries a mixture of authority and psychological intuition. He knows, as he always knows, that there's more. Richard, Thomas hesitates, his eyes avoiding direct contact. No, I think I've told you everything. Margaret, watching intently, interjects in a trembling voice. He's lying. There's still something there. I've known those expressions for 25 years. Doctor. Phil turns to the production crew. I understand that we received a package today sent by Susan Blackwood, the woman who initially contacted the Wilson family. He gestures, and a production assistant approaches with a sealed cardboard box. Susan sent this with specific instructions for it to be opened during our program. The assistant places the box on a central table. Dr. Phil dramatically cuts the tape and opens the flaps. Inside are several documents and a larger, sealed envelope with the word evidence written in large, red letters. "Let's see what we have here," says Dr. Phil, his calm voice contrasting with the growing tension in the studio. He pulls out the documents and begins to examine them. Here we have Thomas Reynolds' original birth certificate, Connecticut tax, records, photographs of the first family. He shows the photos to the camera, young Thomas smiling next to a beautiful woman and 3 small children. Margaret lets out a muffled sob as she looks at the images. Jennifer puts her hand over her mouth, clearly shaken by seeing this tangible evidence of her father's other life. And this, Dr. Phil continued, picking up the sealed envelope, apparently contains information that Susan found particularly relevant. He opened the envelope with careful deliberation, creating a moment of almost unbearable tension. From inside the envelope, Dr. Phil pulls out a stack of court documents. His face visibly changes as he examines them. When he finally looks at Richard Thomas, his eyes are as hard as granite. "Thomas Reynolds," he says, his voice now carrying a tone he rarely uses, that of genuine contempt. "These are records from a 1996 criminal case against you in Connecticut. A case that was never completed because you disappeared before the trial." Richard Thomas goes completely pale. "Dr. Phil, please. You weren't accused of gambling debts." Dr. Phil continued, relentlessly. "You were accused of embezzling funds from the company where you worked as an accountant. Over $200,000. And the most shocking thing," he held up another document, a restraining order filed by your wife, Laura, alleging physical abuse against her and the children. A shocked murmur runs through the audience. Margaret suddenly stands up, staggering as if she'd been hit. "Child abuse," she whispers, horrified. Richard Thomas gets up to. "It's not what it looks like. It was a misunderstanding so serious that your wife obtained a restraining order to keep you away from your own children," Dr. Phil asks, his voice rising. "A misunderstanding that coincided with you fleeing justice, abandoning your family, and creating a completely false identity. They were going to arrest me," Richard Thomas finally admits, his voice breaking. "I was going to lose everything. I needed a fresh start." Dr. Phil shakes his head, a slow, deliberate gesture that conveys deep disappointment. So it wasn't about protecting his family from dangerous creditors. It was about escaping the consequences of his own crimes. "You've been close to our children all these years," Margaret whispers, horrified. "Jennifer, Michael, what if you had?" She can't finish the sentence. Michael's anger explodes. He stands up abruptly. "You monster. We live with you. We trust you. You're not my father. You're nothing to us." Richard Thomas steps towards his family, his hands outstretched in supplication. "Please, I never hurt you. I've changed. I've become a better person. Everything I did was to protect our family." "Stop, Dr. Phil's voice rang through the studio with unquestionable authority. "Thomas Reynolds, you have lied to everyone in this room since the moment you walked in. You lied to your first family. You lied to your second family. You are still lying right now." Phil turns to the crew, his expression more serious than any regular viewer has ever seen him. "Stop filming." Now, the studio lights flicker, signaling an interruption in the normal recording. The audience murmurs in confusion. The technicians exchange uncertain glances. Phil. A producer approaches timidly. "I told you to stop filming, Dr. Phil repeats, his voice now more restrained but still full of authority. He turns to Richard Thomas. "I won't allow you to use my program as a platform for more manipulation and lies. I won't allow you to traumatize these people any further, Dr. Phil gestures to security guards who were discreetly positioned in the corners of the studio. "Mr. Reynolds, you will be escorted out of this studio immediately. And I must inform you that the documents we received today, including the records of the embezzlement case you fled from, will be handed over to the appropriate authorities." "You can't do that," Richard Thomas protests, his face contorted between fear and anger. "I can and I will, Dr. Phil replies firmly. "This program exists to help people face the truth and find paths to healing, not to give a platform to fugitive criminals who continue to manipulate and hurt those they claim to love. The security guards approach Richard, Thomas, who looks frantically round like a cornered animal. "Margaret, please," he pleads. 25 years together must mean something. Margaret, still visibly shaken, finds the strength to reply, "That means 25 years of lies." "Go away, Thomas. I don't want to see your face anymore." Silence fills the studio as Richard, Thomas, is escorted out. The audience, usually kept for the duration of the show, is instructed to leave temporarily. Cameras are switched off, microphones muted. Only Dr. Phil, Margaret, and their children remain on stage, along with a few essential producers. "I apologize for what happened here today," says Dr. Phil, sitting closer to the family now. "I rarely interrupt a recording like this, but I felt we needed to create a safe environment, away from the cameras, to process what we just discovered." Margaret looks devastated, but there's also a glimmer of relief in her eyes, the relief that comes with the truth, however painful it may be. "What happens now?" she asks in a low voice. Dr. Phil takes a deep breath. "There's something I didn't mention while we were recording, something we discovered during our investigation, but I thought it would be better to share it privately." Jennifer and Michael lean forward, apprehensive. "When our team spoke with Laura Reynolds in Connecticut, we discovered that Thomas wasn't being entirely honest about his circumstances before running away." Dr. Phil retrieves another envelope, this one kept off camera. "Laura sent us copies of her children's medical records, particularly those of her youngest, Robert, who was only 5 years old when Thomas disappeared." He retrieves the documents from the envelope, his face serious. "Robert was hospitalized 3 times between 1995 and 1997, once with a broken arm, another time with burns on his hands, the third time with a concussion. On all occasions, the explanations given by Thomas for the injuries were considered inconsistent by the doctors." Margaret covers her mouth with her hands. "Oh my God." The restraining order was issued after the concussion incident. Laura finally found the courage to report the abuse. The criminal charges for embezzlement followed soon after, when the company where Thomas worked discovered irregularities in the accounts he managed. Dr. Phil looks directly at Michael and Jennifer. "You need to understand something very important. The man you knew is your father, even though he lied about his identity, and his past never displayed abusive behavior towards you. Am I right?" Both confirm, still stunned by the revelations. "What this suggests," Dr. Phil continues, "is that despite all his flaws, he genuinely tried to be a different person with you all. I'm not excusing his actions. What he did was unforgivable on many levels, but I believe there's an element of redemption in his story, however twisted it may be." "Redemption?" Michael asks, incredulous. "He abandoned 3 children who were suffering abuse at his hands." "Exactly," Dr. Phil agrees. "And then, for whatever reason, guilt, regret, or a genuine desire for change, he strove to be the kind of father to you that he failed to be to his first children." He pauses meaningfully. "That doesn't erase what he did, nor does it make his lies acceptable, but it explains, perhaps, why he clung so desperately to this new identity. Richard Wilson was the version of himself that didn't abuse his children, that didn't steal, that was honorable and respected." Jennifer, her eyes brimming with tears, speaks in a choked voice. "Should this make me feel better, knowing that my father was a monster to other children, but chose not to be a monster to me?" Dr. Phil shakes his head. "No, it shouldn't make you feel any better, but maybe it will help you understand, and understanding is the first step in processing trauma like this." Margaret, who has been quiet, finally speaks. "What happens to him now? Legally, I mean. The documents we received today reveal crimes that, technically, are still within the statute of limitations," explains Dr. Phil. "We have already notified the authorities. Thomas Reynolds, or Richard Wilson, as you knew him, will likely face charges for these old crimes, in addition to new charges related to identity fraud and impersonating a military veteran." "And what about us?" Michael asks. "Our documents, our name, everything is linked to a false identity. You did nothing wrong," Dr. Phil assures them. "My legal team is already working to ensure you are legally protected. As for the emotional aspect," he looks at each of them with genuine compassion, "this will take time. Betrayal at such a deep and prolonged level leaves scars that don't disappear overnight." The cameras are reactivated. The audience returns, now aware that something significant happened during their absence. Dr. Phil stands alone in the center of the stage, his expression serious but composed. On our show today, we were confronted with a situation unprecedented even by Dr. Phil's standards. His voice resonates through the studio with authority. For more than 2 decades, a man has lived a complete lie, not just an occasional deception, but a totally fabricated identity, built on abandoning a family and fleeing serious criminal charges. The camera shows Margaret and her children now sitting together, united in their shared grief, but visibly calmer after their private conversation. Richard, Thomas, is nowhere to be seen. For the first time in 19 seasons, I made the decision to remove a guest from my show and stop the recording. Dr. Phil walks slowly across the stage, his tone reflective. I did this because there are limits to what we allow here. This is not a stage for manipulators to continue their manipulations. It is not a forum where we allow people who have caused profound harm to justify their destructive behaviors. He pauses, approaching Margaret and her children. This courageous family came here today seeking answers, and although the answers were more painful than any of us could have imagined, I believe they now have the truth they need to begin rebuilding their lives. Dr. Phil turns directly to the camera, speaking now not only to the studio, but to the millions who will watch this episode. I believe in the power of truth. I believe that, no matter how painful, the truth always opens paths to healing that lies permanently blocked. The man we know as Richard Wilson spent 25 years running from the truth about who he was, about what he had done, about the damage he had caused. He glances briefly at the documents in his hand, the records of a life of deceit. But there is something powerful we can learn even from this extreme case. Thomas Reynolds fled his past and created a new identity, not only with forged documents, but with different behaviors. The man who abused his children in Connecticut became the man who, as far as we know, never raised a hand against his second family. The man who stole from his employer became a respected worker in his new community. Dr. Phil pauses for a significant moment. This doesn't excuse or minimize his crimes. It doesn't alleviate the pain of the families he deceived and traumatized. But it illustrates an important truth about human nature. People can change their behavior, even when they are running from their own shadows. The question is, how much more powerful could those changes be if they were grounded in truth, accountability, and genuine reparation rather than in more layers of lies? He walks back to the center of the stage, his posture erect and determined. To Margaret, Jennifer, and Michael, you were victims of an extraordinary betrayal. But your worth and dignity are not defined by the lies he told. The moments you shared, the love you felt, the lives you built together, these things have their own truth, separate from his falsehoods. Phil looks directly at the camera, his expression intensely serious. And to those of you watching who may be living your own lives, big or small, I implore you to consider the real cost. Lies are like debts that always grow with interest. The longer we spend avoiding the truth, the greater the damage becomes when it finally emerges, and the truth always finds a way to emerge. He's approaching the Wilson family again. That's why I stopped recording today, because there are times when we need to say enough to manipulation, times when we need to create clear boundaries between what we tolerate and what we reject, times when we need to protect those who have already suffered enough harm. Dr. Phil makes his characteristic gesture, leaning slightly forward. Rebuilding won't be easy for this family, but it begins now, today, with the truth finally exposed and an opportunity to move forward without the weight of the lies that have held them captive for so long. He turns to the camera one last time, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades counseling people through their deepest crises. And always remember, you can't change what you don't acknowledge. True transformation begins with the truth, no matter how painful it may be. And that's what makes the difference between an authentic life and an existence built on quicksand. The studio lights begin to dim gradually, signaling the end of one of the most intense episodes in the history of the Dr. Phil Show. And so we conclude this extraordinary episode. Thank you for joining us. Until next time.